Continuing where I left off, Chapter 7. On the 12th of November, Kutuzov's combat troops, encamped near Olmutz, were preparing to be reviewed the next day by the two emperors, the Russian and the Austrian. The guards, having just arrived from Russia, spent the night 15 versts from Olmutz, and were to proceed straight to the review, appearing on the field at Olmutz by 10 o'clock in the morning. That day, Nikolai Rostov received a note from Boris informing him that the Ismailovo regiment was quartered 15 versts from Olmutz and that he wanted to see him as he had money and a letter for him. Rostov was particularly in need of money now that the troops, after their campaign, were stationed near Olmutz, where their camp was swarming with well-supplied canteen keepers and Austrian Jews offering all sorts of tempting wares. The Pavlograd Hussars had been celebrating the awards they had received in the campaign with one feast after another and with excursions to Olmutz to a certain Caroline, the Hungarian, who had recently opened a tavern with girls waiting on the tables. Rostov had just celebrated his promotion to cornet, had bought Denisov's horse Badon, and was in debt all around to his comrades as well as the canteen keepers. On receiving Boris's letter, he rode with a fellow officer to Olmutz, where they dined and drank a bottle of wine, after which he set off alone for the guards' camp to find his childhood friend. He had not yet had time to get his uniform and was wearing a shabby cadet's jacket with a soldier's cross on it, equally shabby riding breeches faced with worn leather, and an officer's saber with a sword knot. His Don horse was one he had bought from a Cossack during the campaign. A crumpled hussar's cap was thrust jauntily back on one side of his hat. As he rode up to the camp of the Ismailovo regiment, he was thinking how his appearance, that of a fighting hussar who had been on the field, would strike Boris and his fellow guards. The guards had made the entire march as if were a pleasant jaunt, parading their cleanliness and discipline. They marched by easy stages, their knapsacks on baggage wagons, and at every halt the Austrian authorities had provided the officers with excellent dinners. The regiments entered the left the towns with bands playing, and by the Grand Duke's orders the men had marched the whole way in the steppe, a point on which the guards pride themselves. The officers on foot and in their proper positions. Boris had been quartered and had marched all the way with Berg, who was already a company commander, having received his captaincy in the course of the campaign. By virtue of his punctiliousness and efficiency, Berg had managed to win the confidence of his superior officers and to arrange his final affairs most advantageously. During campaign, he had made the acquaintance of many persons who might be useful to him, and by means of a letter of recommendation he had brought with him from Pierre, had become acquainted with Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, through whom he hoped to obtain a place on the commander-in-chief's staff. Berg and Boris, freshly and meticulously dressed and having rested at the last day's march, were sitting in the immaculate quarters assigned to them, playing chess. Berg held a long smoking pipe between his knees. Boris, with characteristic precision, was building a pyramid of chessmen with his delicate white fingers and watching his partner's face while waiting for him to move, obviously thinking about the game just as he's always thought, only of what he was doing. "Well, how are you going to get out of that?" he asked. "We shall try," replied Berg, fingering a pawn and then withdrawing his hand. At that moment the door opened. "At last, here he is," shouted Rostov. "And Berg too! Ah, you pestis fan! Allez, coucher, dormir," he cried, repeating a phrase that his nurse used to say in bad French, at which he and Boris used to laugh. "Good Lord, how you've changed," said Boris, not neglecting to steady and put back in place some falling chessmen as he got up to greet Rostov. He was about to embrace his friend, but Nikolai drew back, with that peculiar feeling of youth, that dread of following the beaten path, and the wish to express its feelings in some new way of its own, different from that of its elders, which is often hypocritical. Nikolai wanted to do something special on meeting his friend. To pinch him, push him, anything rather than kiss him, which was what everyone did. Boris, on the contrary, embraced him in a calm, friendly way and kissed him 3 times. It was almost 3 months since they had seen each other, and being at an age when young men take their first steps on the path of life, each found immense changes in the other, quite new reflections of the society in which they had taken those steps. Both had changed greatly since their last meeting, and both were in haste to display these changes. "Oh, you damn peacocks! Fresh and clean as you just come from a feat. Not like us poor devils in the line," said Rostov, pointing with a martial swagger to his mud-stained riding breeches, and speaking in a baritone voice that was new to Boris. The German landlady, hearing Rostov's loud voice, poked her head in at the door. "Pretty little thing, isn't she?" said Rostov with a wink. "Why do you shout so?" "You'll scare them," said Boris. "I didn't expect you today," he added. "I only sent you the note yesterday through one of Kutuzov's adjutants who happens to be a friend of mine, Bokovsky. I didn't think he would get it to you so quickly. Well, how are you? Been under fire already?" Without answering, Rostov pointed to his bandaged arm, flicked the St. George cross that hung from the cording of his uniform in a soldierly fashion, and glanced at Berg with a smile. "As you see," he said. "Yes, of course, yes," Berg smiling. "We've had a splendid campaign too, you know. His Imperial Highness rode with our regiment most of the time, so that we had every comfort and convenience. What receptions we had in Poland, what dinners and balls, I can't tell you, and the Sasevich was very gracious to all our officers." And the two friends recounted their exploits to each other, the one telling about the hussars, revels, and life at the front, the other about the amenities and the advantages of serving under the command of high-ranking personages, and so on. "Oh, you guard," said Rostov. "Come, let's send for some wine." Boris frowned. "If you really want it," he said, going to his bed. He took his purse from under the clean pillows and sent for wine. "And I must give you the money and letter I have for you," he added. Rostov took the letter, and tossing the money onto the sofa, sat down with his elbows on the table and commenced reading it. He read several lines, then glanced angrily at Berg. Meeting his eyes, he hid his face behind the letter. "Looks as if they sent you a tidy sum," said Berg, eyeing the heavy purse that made a depression on the sofa. "Here we are trying to scrape along on our pay, Count. I can tell you in my own case." "See here, my friend," said Rostov to Berg. "When you get a letter from home and meet one of your own people whom you want to ask about everything, if I happen to be there, I'll clear out at once. So I won't be in your way. Now do go, please. Go somewhere, anywhere. Go to hell," he cried, then instantly seized him by the shoulder and looked affably into his face, evidently trying to mitigate the rudeness of his words. "Don't be angry, my dear fellow," he added. "You know I speak from the heart to an old friend like you." "Oh, don't mention it, Count. I quite understand," said Berg in a muffled, guttural voice as he rose to go. "You might go and see our hosts," suggested Boris. "They invited you." Berg put on an immaculate coat, without so much as a spot or a speck of dust on it, stood in front of the mirror, and brushed up the hair on his temples, which he wore in the style of Alexander Pavlovich, and having assured himself by Rostov's expression that his coat had been noticed, left the room with an affable smile. "What a beast I am, really," muttered Rostov as he read the letter. "Why? Oh, what a swine I've been not once to have written, and then to have given them such a scare," he repeated, flushing suddenly. "Well, did you send Gavrila for the wine? All right, let's have some." Among the letters from his family was enclosed a letter of recommendation to Bagration, which, on Anna Mikhailova's advice, the old countess had obtained through acquaintances and sent to her son, urging him to present it and make use of it. "What nonsense! What do I want with that?" exclaimed Rostov, throwing the letter under the table. "Why have you thrown that away?" asked Boris. "It's some sort of letter of recommendation. What the devil do I want a letter for?" "Why, what the devil?" said Boris, picking up the letter and reading the address. "The letter might be very useful to you." "I don't need anything, and I'm not going to be anyone's adjutant." "Why not?" asked Boris. "It's a lackey's job." "You're still the same dreamer, I see," said Boris, shaking his head. "And you're still the same diplomat, but that's besides the point. Now tell me, how are you?" asked Rostov. "Just as you see. So far, everything's all right. But I confessed I should very much like to be made an adjutant and not remain at the front. Why? Because once you've gone in for a military career, you ought to try to make as brilliant a career of it as possible. Oh, so that's why, said Rostov, evidently thinking of something else. He looked intently and inquiringly into his friend's face, as if trying in vain to find the answer to some question. Ode Gavrila brought the wine. Shouldn't we send for Alphonse Karlovich now? Asked Boris. He'll drink with you. I can't. Yes, send for him. Well, how do you get on with that Dutchman? Asked Rostov with a scornful smile. He's very, very nice, a pleasant, honest fellow, said Boris. Rostov again peered intently into Boris's face and sighed. Berg returned, and conversation among the three officers grew animated over the bottle of wine. The guardsmen told Rostov of their campaign and how they had been celebrated in Russia, Poland, and abroad. They recounted the sayings and doings of their commander, the Grand Duke, told anecdotes concerning his kind-heartedness and fits of temper. Berg, as usual, remained silent when the subject did not relate to himself, but in connection with the Grand Duke's irascibility, he delighted in telling how he had managed to deal with an encounter with him, when, on making a tour of the regiments in Galicia, the Grand Duke had flown into a rage over some irregularity he had found. With an affable smile, Berg related how the Grand Duke had ridden up to him and shouted, "Arnuts!" This was the savage favorite expression when he lost his temper, and called for the company commander. Would you believe it, Count? I wasn't in the least alarmed, because I knew I was in the right. You know, Count, without boasting, I may say that I know the regiment orders by heart, and know the regulations well as know the Lord's Prayer, and consequently, Count, there is never any negligence in my company. So my conscience was clear. I stepped forward. Berg stood up and showed how he had presented himself with his right hand, raised the visor of his cap, and indeed it would have been difficult to imagine a face more respectful and complacent. And how he railed at me, as they say, railed and railed. It was a fight to the death, as they say, with Arnuts and dams and off to Siberia, said Berg, with a sagacious smile. I knew I was in the right, so I kept silent. Was that not best, Count? What's the matter? Are you dumb? He shouted. Still I remained silent. And what do you think, Count? The following day, there was nothing about it in the orders of the day. That's what comes of keeping one's head. Yes, indeed, Count, said Berg, drawing on his pipe and blowing smoke rings. Yes, that was admirable, said Rostov with a smile. But Boris noticed that Rostov was on the point of making fun of Berg, and adroitly changed the subject. He asked Rostov to tell him where and how he had received his wound. This pleased Rostov, and he began telling them about it, growing more and more impassioned as he talked. He described the Shagrabin action exactly as men who have taken part in battle generally describe them, that is, as they would like to have been, as they have heard them described by others, and making them sound more glorious and quite unlike what they actually were. Rostov was a truthful young man, and would on no account have told a deliberate lie. He began with the intention of relating everything exactly as it happened, but imperceptibly, unconsciously, and inevitably, he slipped into falsehood. If he had told the truth to his listeners, who, like himself, had heard numerous stories of cavalry attacks, he formed a definite idea of what an attack was, and were expecting to hear just such a story. Either they would not have believed him, or, still worse, they would have thought that Rostov himself was at fault, since what generally happened to those taking part in a cavalry charge had not happened to him. He could not tell them simply that everyone had set out a trot, that he had fallen from his horse, sprained his arm, and then he had run from a Frenchman into woods as fast as his legs would carry him. Besides, to describe everything as it was, telling only what had really happened, would have required great self-control. To tell the truth is very difficult, and young people are really capable of it. His listeners expected to hear how, fired with excitement and beside him, he had swept down on the enemy square like a tempest, cut his way in, slashing right and left, and how his saber had tasted blood and had fallen exhausted, and so on. And these are the things he told them. In the middle of his story, just as he was saying, You can't imagine what a strange frenzy takes possession of one during an attack. Prince Andrei Bolsky, whom Boris was expecting, came into the room. Prince Andrei enjoyed being a patron to young people, was flattered by an appeal to his influence, and being well disposed to Boris, who had succeeded in making a favorable impression on him the day before, was pleased to fill the young man's request. Having been sent with papers from Kutuzov to the Tsarevich, he looked in on the young man, hoping to find him alone. When he came into the room and saw a little lion hussar recounting his military exploits, the sort of person Prince Andrei could not endure, he gave Boris a friendly smile, but frowned and narrowed his eyes as he made Rostov a slight bow before languidly and wearily sitting down on the sofa. He was displeased at finding himself in an undesirable company. Rostov perceived this and flushed, but he did not care. The man was nothing to him. When he glanced at Boris, however, he saw that he too appeared to be ashamed of the lion hussar, in spite of Prince Andrei's unpleasant, ironical tone, and in spite of the contempt with which Rostov, from his point of view, as a combat officer, regarded all these little staff adjutants, among whom the newcomer obviously ranked. He was abashed, turned red, and fell silent. Boris inquired what news the staff had received, and what, if one might ask without indiscretion, had been heard of our plan of action. We shall probably advance, said Bolsky, obviously reluctant to say any more in the presence of strangers. Berg took the opportunity to inquire with marked deference whether, as he had heard, the forage allowance to company commanders would be doubled. To this Prince Andrei replied with a smile that he was unable to give an opinion on so grave a governmental disposition, and Berg laughed with delight. As to what business of yours, Prince Andrei said, turning to Boris, we'll talk about it later, and he glanced at Rostov. Come to me after the review, and we'll do what we can. After glancing around the room, he turned to Rostov, whose state of childish, ungovernable confusion had now changed to anger. He did not condescend to notice, and said, I believe you were talking to the Shangrebin engagement. Were you there? I was, said Rostov irately, as if wanting to insult the adjutant. Bolkowski was aware of the hussar's state of mind, and amused him. He smiled rather disdainfully. Yes, one hears so many stories now about the engagement, he said. Stories, yes, said Rostov in a loud voice, looking now at Boris, now at Bolkowski with eyes suddenly grown furious. Yes, there are a great many stories, but ours are the stories of men who were there, under enemy fire. Our stories have some weight, unlike the tales of those fine fellows on the staff who are rewarded for doing nothing. A group to which you imply that I belong? Asked Prince Andrei, with a composed and a particularly amiable smile. Rostov was filled with a strange feeling of rage mingled with respect for this man's self-possession. I'm not talking about you, he said. I do not know you, nor frankly do I care to. I'm speaking of staff officers in general. And I will say this to you, Prince Andrei cut him short in a tone of quiet authority. You wish to insult me, and I am quite prepared to agree that it would not be difficult to do so, should you be deficient in self-respect. But you will agree that the time and place are exceedingly ill chosen. In a few days, we shall all have to take part in a great and a much more serious duel. And besides, Tolstoy, who tells me he is an old friend of yours, is in no way to blame that my face unfortunately happens to displease you. However, he said, getting up, you know my name and where to find me. But bear in mind, he added, that I do not consider either myself or you as having been insulted. And my advice as a man older than you is to let the matter drop. On Friday, then after the review, I shall expect you, Drabostua. Au revoir, he said, and with a bow to both men went out. Only after Prince Andrei had gone did Rostov think of what he ought to have said in reply to him, and he was still more angry for not having said it. He immediately ordered his horse to be brought round, and after coldly taking leave of Boris, rode off. Whether to go to headquarters the next day and challenge that pretentious little adjutant to a duel, or to let the matter drop, was a question that tormented him all the way back. At one moment he thought with an animosity of pleasure it would give him to see the fright of the proud, weak little men when facing his pistol. The next moment he felt with amazement that all of the men he knew there was no one he would rather have as a friend than that same detestable little adjutant. Number 9. The day after Rostov's visit to Boris, there was a review of the Austrian and Russian troops, both those freshly arrived from Russia and those who had been campaigning with Kutuzov. The two emperors, the Russian with his hair, the Tsarevich, and the Austrian and the Archduke reviewed the allied army of 80,000 men. From early morning, the clean, smartly turned out troops were on the move, lining up on the field before the fortress. Now thousands of legs, bayonets, waving banners halted, and the officer's command turned and formed up at intervals, wheeling around other similar masses of infantry in different uniforms. Now the rhythmic hoofbeats, the jingling of dashing cavalry in uniforms trimmed with dark blue, red, and green piping, the bandsmen in front wearing embroidered uniforms, mounted on raven, chestnut, and gray horses. Now between the cavalry and the infantry crawled a long line of artillery, the polished gleaming cannons smelling of line stocks, and shuddering on their gun carriages as they drew up to their designated positions with a brazen clatter. Not only the generals in full dress uniform, their thick or thin waists drawn into the utmost, their red necks squeezed into tight collars, wearing stocks, and all their decorations, not only those pomaded officers in full regalia, but every soldier with his freshly washed and shaven face, and his equipment cleaned and polished till it shone, and every horse groomed till its coat gleamed like a satin and wetted mane laid smooth, felt that what was taking place was not to be taken lightly, but was a matter of consequence and solemnity. Every general and soldier felt his own significance. And was conscious of being a grain of sand in the sea of men. At the same time, he felt his own might, being conscious of himself as part of the great whole. The bustle and intense exertion had been going on since early morning, and by 10 o'clock all was in required order with the ranks lined up on the vast field. The forces were drawn up in 3 lines, the cavalry in front, the artillery behind it, then the infantry. The armies were sharply Zov's combat troops, on the right flank of which stood the Pavlograd hussars in the front line, and the guards and the regiments of the lines recently arrived from Russia and the Austrian troops. But they all stood in one line under one command and in an identical formation. Like wind through the leaves swept the whisperer, "They're coming, they're coming." Cries of alarm were heard as a wave of last-minute preparations ran through the troops. At the same moment, although the day was still, a light breeze rose over the army. The colors fluttered on the lances, and the unfurled banners flapped against the staffs. It was as if this ripple of movement, an army itself, was expressing its joy at the appearance of the emperors. A single voice was heard, "Attention!" and like the crowing of cocks at sunrise, the cry repeated at various points. Then all was still. In the death-like silence, only the sound of hoofbeats were heard. This was the emperor's suite. As the emperor rode up to the flank, the buglers at the 1st Cavalry Regiment struck up the general's march. It seemed as though not only the Bulgars, but the army itself, rejoicing in the emperor's approach, had spontaneously produced these sounds. Only the genial, youthful voice of the Emperor Alexander could be heard through the music. He spoke his words of greeting, and the 1st Regiment cheered, "Hooray!" in such a deafening, prolonged, and joyous roar that the men themselves were awed by the multitude and the might of the host they constituted. Standing in the foremost ranks of Kutuzov's army was the Tsar approached. Rostov experienced the same feeling as every other man in that army, a feeling of self-oblivion, a proud consciousness of might, and a passionate devotion to him who was the cause of that triumphant occasion. One word from that man, he felt, this huge mass, including the insignificant grain that was himself, would go through fire and water, commit crimes, die, or perform deeds of the greatest heroism. And he could not but tremble, and his heart stood still at the immensity of that word. "Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" thundered from all sides as one regiment after another greeted the Tsar with the strains of the general's march. And again, "Hooray!" and the march, and "Hooray!" and "Hooray!" the sound increasing and swelling into a deafening roar. Each regiment in its silent immobility was like a lifeless body till the Tsar reached it. But the instant he came leveled with it, it came to life, its thunder joining the roar of the line along which he had already passed. Through the terrible, deafening sound of those voices, amid the mass of troops standing motionless in the squares, as if turned to stone, the hundreds of officers composing the suites rode casually, but symmetrically, and above all freely, and in front of them 2 men, the emperors, and upon these 2 men the undivided, rapt, and passionate attention of that mass of men was concentrated. The handsome young Emperor Alexander, wearing the uniform of the Horse Guards and a cocked hat, with his pleasant face and resonant though subdued voice, attracted the full force of their attention. Rostov stood not far from the Bulgars, and with his keen sight had recognized the Tsar from a distance, and watched his approach. When he was within 20 paces, and Nikolai could clearly distinguish every feature of that handsome, happy, youthful face, he experienced a feeling of tenderness and ecstasy such as he had never before known. Everything about the Tsar, every feature, every gesture seemed to him entrancing. Stopping in front of the Pavlograd regiment, the Tsar said something in French to the Austrian emperor and smiled. Seeing that smile, Rostov involuntarily smiled himself and felt an even stronger access of love for his sovereign. He longed to express his love in some way, and knowing that this was impossible, he was ready to weep. The Tsar called the regimental commander and said in a few words to him, "O God, what would happen if the Tsar were to speak to me?" thought Rostov. "I should die of happiness." The Tsar also addressed the officers. "I thank you all, gentlemen." To Rostov every word was like a voice from heaven. "I thank you all with my heart." How gladly would Rostov have died then and there for his Tsar. "You have won the St. George standards, and I know you will be worthy of them." Oh, to die for him, thought Rostov. The Tsar said something more, which Rostov did not hear, and the soldiers straining their lungs shouted, "Hooray!" Rostov, too, bending over his saddle, shouted with all his might, wishing he might injure himself with that cry, if only to give full expression to his rapture. The Tsar remained for a few seconds facing the hussars, as if undecided. How can the Emperor be uncertain, Rostov wondered. But then, even this uncertainty seemed to him majestic and enchanting, like everything else the Tsar did. The Tsar's hesitation lasted only for an instant. His foot, in the narrow, pointed boot, then fashionable, touched the belly of the bobtail bay mare he was riding. He took up the reins in his white gloved hand and moved up, accompanied by the unevenly swaying sea of aides-de-camp. Farther and farther he rode, stopping at the other regiments, till finally only the white plume of his hat was visible to Rostov amid the suite surrounding the 2 emperors. Among the gentlemen of the suite, Rostov had noticed Belsky sitting his horse indolently and looking unconcerned. Recalling his quarrel with him the day before, Rostov wondered whether or not he ought to challenge him. Of course not, he now thought. Is it even worth thinking or speaking of such a moment, of it as such a moment, at a time of such love, rapture, and self-sacrifice? What do any of our quarrels and insults matter? I love and forgive everyone now. When the Emperor had made a tour of almost all the regiments, the troops began a ceremonial past him, and Rostov on Bedonian, the horse had recently bought from Denisov, rode at the rear of his squadron, that is, alone and in full view of the Emperor. Before reaching him, Rostov was an excellent horseman, spurred Bedouin twice, and succeeding in putting him to a furious trot, the gait into which the horse always fell when excited. Bending his foaming muzzle to his chest, his tail extended, Bedouin seemed to feel the Emperor's eye upon him, and with a high, graceful action of the legs, as if flying through the air without touching the ground, passed him in a superb stop. Rostov himself, his legs well back, his stomach drawn in, feeling himself of one with his horse, rode past the Emperor. Like a viewy devil, as Denisov said. "Bravo, Palagraski," said the Emperor. "My God, how happy I should be if he were to order me to throw myself into the fire this instant," thought Rostov. When the review was over, the newly arrived officers and those of Kutupov's army gathered in groups and commenced talking of the honors that had been conferred. of the Austrians in their uniforms of the front line, and of Bonaparte, and how badly he would fare now, especially when the Essen Corps arrived and Pusher joined their side. But the chief topic of our conversation in every group was the Emperor Alaska. Every word he had spoken was gone over and over. Every gesture described what delight. They all had but one wish, under the Tsar's command, to advance with all the speed against the enemy. Led by the Tsar himself, they could not fail to vanquish anyone, whoever he might be. So thought Rostov and most of the officers after the review. They were all more confident of victory than they would have been after winning 2 battles. Chapter 9. The day after the review, Boris, dressed in his best uniform, and having received his friend Berg's good wishes for success, rode to Olmutz to see Bolkowski, hoping to profit by his kindness to obtain for himself the best possible post, preferably that of adjutant to an important personage, which was the position that particularly attracted him in the army. It's all very well for Rostov, whose father sends him 10,000 rubles at a time, to talk about not wishing to kowtow to anyone or to be a lackey, but I, who have nothing but my own wits, have to make a career and cannot let any opportunity pass without taking advantage of it. He did not find Prince Andrei in Olmutz that day, but just seeing the town where general headquarters and the diplomatic corps were stationed, and where the 2 emperors were staying with their suites, courtiers, and households, intensified his desire to belong to that higher world. He knew no one there, and despite his dashing guardsman uniform, those exalted personages, courtiers, and military men alike, who were driving about in their elegant carriages, with their plumes, orders, and decorations, all seemed so immeasurably above him, a mere officer of the guards, as to be not only unwilling, but positively unable to acknowledge his existence. At the quarters of the commander-in-chief, Kutuzov, where he inquired for Bolkowski, all the adjutants and even the orderlies looked at him as if they wished to impress on him that countless officers of his sort were hanging about there, and that everyone was thoroughly fed up with him. In spite of this, or rather because of it, after dinner the following day, the 15th, he again went to Olmutz, and going to the house occupied by Kutuzov, asked for Bolkowski. Prince Andrei was in, and Boris was shown into a large hall that at one time had probably been used for dancing, but in which there were now 5 beds and various other pieces of furniture, tables, chairs, and clavichord. One, the adjutants, the one nearest the door, was sitting at a table in a Persian dressing gown, writing. Another, stout, red face, Nevesky, was lying in the bed with his hands under his head, laughing with an officer who sat near him, and a third was playing a Viennese waltz on the clavichord, while a fourth laid on the top of the clavichord singing. Bolkowski was not in the room. None of these gentlemen changed his position on seeing Boris. The one who was writing, to whom Boris spoke, looked up with an air of annoyance and told him that Bolkowski was on duty, and that he should go through the door on the left to the reception room if he wanted to see him. Boris thanked him and went to the reception room. There were about a dozen men, officers, and generals in the room. When Boris entered, Prince Andrei, his eye disdainfully narrowed, with that peculiar look of polite wariness that clearly says, "If it were not my duty, I would not for an instant talk to you," was listening to the old Russian general with many decorations, who stood rigidly erect, almost on tiptoe, and with the obsequious expression of a soldier on his flushed face, who was reporting something to Prince Andrei. "Very well. Be so good as to wait," said Prince Andrei to the general, speaking Russian with the French accent he always affected when he wished to show contempt. Then, catching sight of Boris, he took no further notice of the general, who ran after him, entreating him to hear him out, but nodded and turned to Boris with a bright smile. At that moment, Boris clearly realized what he had before surmised, which was that in the army, apart from the subordination and discipline prescribed by the regulations in which he and everyone else in the regiment knew, there was another more fundamental subordination, which made this erect, purple-faced general wait respectfully while Captain Prince Andrei found it more convenient to chat with Lieutenant Japotusko for his own pleasure. Boris resolved more firmly than ever to act in future, not according to the prescribed regulations, but to his unwritten code. He now felt that by the mere fact of having been recommended to Prince Andrei, he had all at once risen above the general. In other circumstances, at the front, had the power to annihilate him. A more lieutenant of the guards, Prince Andrei, came up to him and took his hand. "Very sorry you didn't find me in yesterday. I was busy the whole day with the Germans. We went with Weyrother to check the dispositions, and when a German starts being accurate, there's no end to it." Boris smiled, as if he understood what Prince Andrei was alluding to, as if in fact it were a matter of common knowledge. But it was the first time he had heard the name Weyrother, or even the term dispositions. "Well, my dear fellow, so you still want to be an adjutant. I have been thinking about you." "Yes, I was considering," said Boris, blushing for some reason, applying to the commander-in-chief. "He has had a letter from the Prince Kuragin about me. I wanted to inquire only because I'm afraid the guards won't go into action," he added, as if he were excusing himself. "Good, good. We'll talk it over," said Prince Andrei. "Just let me report this gentleman's business, and I shall be at your disposal." While Prince Andrei went to make his report on behalf of the purple-faced general, that gentleman, apparently not sharing Boris's views of the advantages of the unwritten code, glared so persistently at the presumptuous lieutenant who had prevented his finishing what he had to say to the adjutant that Boris felt uncomfortable. He turned away and waited impatiently for Prince Andrei to return from the commander-in-chief's room. "You see, my dear fellow, I have been thinking about you," said Prince Andrei, when they had gone into the big room in which the clavichord stood. "It's no use your going to the commander-in-chief. He'll say a lot of polite things to you and tell you that you must come and dine with him. That wouldn't be at all bad for the unwritten code," thought Boris, but nothing more would come of it. There would soon be a whole battalion of us adjutants and early officers. But this is what we shall do. I have a good friend, Prince Dolokhorov, who is an adjutant general and an excellent fellow, and though you may not be aware of it, the fact is that Kutuzov and his staff and all of us here are of absolutely no account at present. Everything centers upon the Tsar now, so we shall go straight to Dolokhorov. I shall have to see him in any case, and I have already spoken to him about you. We'll see whether he might find it possible to attach you to his staff or find you a place nearer the sun. Prince Andrei was always particularly keen when he had occasion to guide a young man and help him to attain worldly success. Under the guise of obtaining help of this sort for another, which he was too proud ever to have accepted for himself, he came in contact with the spirit that confers success and which attracted him. He very readily took up Boris's cause and went with him to see Prince Dolokhorov. It was late in the evening when they entered the palace at Olmutz in which the two emperors and their retinues were living. There had been a council of war that day at which both emperors and all the members of the Half-Kriegsrat had been present. At that council, contravening the advice of the old generals, Kutuzov and Schwarzenberg, it had been decided to advance without delay and give battle to Bonaparte. The council of war had only just ended when Prince Andrei and Boris arrived at the palace seeking Prince Dolokhorov. Everyone at headquarters was still under the spell of the victory won that day by the party of the young members of the war council. The voices of those who counselled delay and advised, waiting for one reason or another before advancing, had been silenced with such unanimity, and their arguments refuted with such conclusive proof of the advantages of the attack, that what had been discussed in the council, the coming battle and the certain victory, no longer seemed to be in the future but in the past. All the advantages were on our side. Our enormous forces, undoubtedly superior to Napoleon's, were concentrated in one place. The troops, inspired by the presence of the emperors, were eager for action. The strategic point where the action would take place was known in detail to Weyrother, the general in command of the Austrian troops. By a fortunate coincidence, the Austrian army had held maneuvers the preceding year on the very fields where now the French were to be fought, and the adjacent terrain was equally familiar, had been mapped into minute detail, while Bonaparte, apparently weakened, was undertaking nothing. Dolokhorov, one of the most vehement advocates of the attack, had just returned from the council, weary and exhausted, but still enthusiastic, and proud of the victory that had been won. Prince Andrei presented his protege, and Prince Dokorov politely and warmly shook Boris's hand, but said nothing to him. Evidently unable to restrain himself from expressing what was uppermost in his mind at the moment, he commenced talking to Prince Andrei in French. "Well, my dear fellow, what a battle we have won! God grant that one which is to result from it would be as victorious. And I must confess, my dear fellow," he went on, speaking in eager staccato phrases, "I have been unjust to the Austrians, and especially to Weyrother. What meticulous precision, what a knowledge of the terrain, what foresight for every eventuality, for every condition down to the most minute detail. No, my dear fellow, it would be impossible to devise more advantageous circumstances than those we are now. The combination of Austrian precision and Russian valor, what more could you want?" "So the attack had been definitely decided on?" asked Bolkonsky. "And do you know, my dear fellow, I believe that Bonaparte has unquestionably reached an impasse. You know that a letter came from him today from the Emperor?" Dolorov smiled knowingly. "Really? What did he say?" asked Bolkonsky. "What can he say, Fedorov?" And so forth and so on, all simply to gain time. "I tell you, he is on our hands, that's certain." "But what was most amusing," he continued, suddenly breaking into a genial laugh, "was that we couldn't think how to address them in reply. If not as consul, and as needless to say, not as emperor, then it seemed to me it ought to be as General Bonaparte. But between not recognizing him as an emperor and calling him General Bonaparte, there's a quite difference," said Bolkonsky. "That's just the point," said Dolokhorov, quietly interrupting him with a laugh. "You know Bilibin, terribly clever fellow. He suggested addressing him as usurper and enemy of the human race." Dolokhorov laughed merrily. "Is that all?" asked Bolkonsky. "All the same, it was Bilibin who came up with a serious form of address. He's a clever, witty fellow." "What was it?" "To the head of the French government. Ah, chef du gouvernement français," said Prince Dolokhov with grave satisfaction. "Good, isn't it?" "It's good, but he will be exceedingly displeased," observed Bolkonsky. "Oh, yes, exceedingly. My brother knows him. He's dined with him, the present emperor, on more than one occasion in Paris, and he tells me he's never been a more subtle, cunning diplomat, a combination of French adroitness and Italian theatricality. You've heard the anecdote about him and Count Markov. Markov was the only man who knew how to handle him. Do you know the story of the handkerchief? It's a gem." And the voluble Dolokhov, turning now to Boris, now to Prince Andrei, told how Bonaparte, wishing to test Markov, our ambassador, purposely dropped his handkerchief in front of him, undoubtedly expecting Markov to pick it up for him, instead of which Markov dropped his own handkerchief beside it, then picked up his own and left Bonaparte where it laid. "Charming," said Bolkonsky, "but I have come to you as a petitioner, Prince, on behalf of this young man. You see." But before Prince Andrei could finish, an aide-de-camp came into the room to summon Prince Dolgorovkov to the Tsar. "Oh, how annoying," said Dolgorovkov, hastily getting up and shaking hands with Prince Andrei and Boris. "You know, I shall be very glad to do all in my power for both of you and this charming young man." And once more, with an expression of exuberant frivolity and at the same time genuine kind-heartedness, he shook Boris's hand. "But as you see, some other time." The idea of being so close to the higher powers as he felt himself to be at the moment was very thrilling to Boris. He was conscious of being where he was in contact with the springs that set in motion all the colossal movements of that mass of which he, his regiment, felt himself a small, humble, insignificant part. Following Prince Dolokhorov out into the corridor, they encountered, coming out the door to the Tsar room by which Dolgorovkov entered, a short man in civilian dress with a shrewd face and a sharp, prominent jaw, which, without marring his appearance, gave him a singular vivacity and mobility of expression. This small man nodded to Dolgorovkov as to a friend, and fixing his cold, intent gaze on Prince Andrei, walked straight toward him, apparently expecting him to bow or step out of his way. Prince Andrei did neither. A look of animosity appeared on his face, and the young man turned aside and walked down the side of the corridor. "Who was that?" asked Boris. "One of the most remarkable, but to me most distasteful of men, Prince Adam Czartoryski, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It is such a man as he who decides the fate of nations," Bolkowski added with a sigh he could not suppress as they walked out of the palace. The next day the army took the field, and till the battle of Austerlitz, Boris did not succeed in seeing either Bolkowski or Dolokhov again, and remained for a while longer with the Izmailovo regiment. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you so much for watching. Please give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Please subscribe below and give it right here or here, or leave a comment, or don't do anything. Just continue watching, and I'll see you in